In today's presentation, we're going to look at the role of the nervous system in homeostasis. So a specific dot point we're going to look at is outline the role of the nervous system in detecting and responding to environmental change. Before we start, we're going just to revise some of the work that we looked at in the previous presentation about homeostasis. So we know that word homeostasis. We know the word homeostasis. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant or near constant internal environment despite what's going on in the outside external environment. So homeostasis. So we're going to look at homeostasis using a graph just to show that how the body responds to a change in temperature. So on this graph we have our set value. Okay, so this is the ideal body temperature. For example, the ideal body temperature. And what happens with homeostasis is the body responds to changes outside a normal range. And this curve represents the normal range. So let's get that information in there. The yellow line is the set value. So this is the ideal. So for example, body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, and the blue represents the normal range. So the normal range can go above or below the set value. Within this normal range, anything outside the normal range will be detected by the body, and the body will then counteract that change. So we get too high, so counteract change. So if it was temperature, begin to sweat, and at the lower level, counteract change. If the body got too cold, the body begin to shiver. Very important that we look at homeostasis. Two things occurring. We look at it as a detection of change in the body and a counteraction of that change. Now looking at this point a little bit further, we notice it's outlined the role of the nervous system. Okay, so the role of the nervous system. Primarily the role of the nervous system is coordination. So it coordinates the negative feedback mechanism. So we know that the nervous system incorporates what we call the central nervous system, so the CNS, central nervous system, and that is brain and spinal cord. So when I talk about the central nervous system, I'm talking about the brain and spinal cord. We're also talking about the peripheral nervous system, and that is our nerves that sit outside the central nervous system, sit outside the brain and sit outside the spinal cord. And they are broken down a little bit further into what we call motor neurons or motor nerves. We'll distinguish that word neuron in a second, and sensory. As I said, there is a difference between what we call a nerve and a neuron. So this diagram here represents a neuron. So it's an individual cell. Okay, and a whole bunch of neurons together, a bundle of neurons together would be a nerve. So a nerve is a bundle of neurons together. So what we've got here is a picture of a generalized view of a nerve cell, a neuron. So they do look a little bit different. A sensory nerve does look a little bit different from a motor neuron, but in terms of getting the basic ideas of how it works, we'll just look at this generalized view. So let's have a look at it. We've broken up into two bits, our cell body here, our cell body. Our cell body is attached to these things called dendrites. Imagine a nerve is keeping in touch with many other nerves, so we have these dendrites, and they are in contact with other neurons. In our cell body we have our nucleus, and then this long section, which the nerve impulse goes in this direction, is called our axon, and finally our axon terminals. So in general, the dendrites pick up a nerve response for another neuron. We have our cell body, and then we have our axon. So it travels from the dendrites through the cell body along the axon to the axon terminals, where it affects a change. So the way the nerve system is coordinated is what we call the stimulus response pathway. Stimulus response pathway. And you may recall this from stage 5 when we looked at reflex actions. So a reflex action is a nerve response that, when it goes to the central nervous system, doesn't go all the way to the brain, stops at the spinal cord, the level of the spinal cord that the nerve is associated with, and then a response is set out. And this is to enable the body to respond really, really quickly and rapidly to a change, something that might, in fact, hurt us. So the stimulus response pathway has the following segments. The following flowchart looks at the steps involved in a stimulus response pathway. The first part of that is what we call the stimulus. So the stimulus is any information that the body picks up from the outside. So loud noises, flashes of light, objects moving towards the body, heat, pain, those sorts of things are all what we call the stimulus. We're going to use the example of holding onto a match. And holding onto the match far too long, so it burns down and burns the fingers. So in this case, the stimulus is the heat from the match, and that stimulus is then picked up by receptors. So in this example, the receptors would be heat and pain receptors. And that information is set from those receptors via sensory neurons to the central nervous system. So let's say CNS. In this case, it is the part of the spinal cord. In order to enact a very, very quick response, it doesn't go directly to the brain, it goes just to the spinal cord, and then motor nerves to effectors. So in our example, the effectors would be the muscles of the arm and hand, and finally the response. So the response in this circumstance is that we drop the match and our hands move away from the heat source. So for this stimulus response pathway to work, there are a number of different types of receptors. We're just going to go through some of the main receptors now. So some of them we'll use in this course at the moment, others are a part of the option communication, but we'll have a look at them in general just to understand that there are different receptors that pick up different information. So within our skin there are a number of different types of receptors. Okay, so the skin has thermoreceptors, and they are obviously responsible for detecting temperature changes. We also have mechanoreceptors. And they detect touch, pain, and pressure. So there are other receptors in the eyes. So the eyes have photoreceptors, and they can distinguish color, light intensity. So all about light. The ears have a different type of mechanoreceptors. And they distinguish sound and space. So where you are in space, a bit of a balance, those sorts of things. Also the tongue. Tongue has a very, very important role in taste. They are chemoreceptors. So they're kind of external receptors that pick up information from the outside. There are there are internal receptors as well, and they call these interoreceptors. And there are different receptors for pH, for how acid or alkaline the blood is, body temperature. There's more to do with if you're exercising, internal body temperature is increasing because there is more cellular respiration to make glucose. Byproduct of that is heat. Osmotic pressure. Pressure gradients of water and ions and salts. And chemical composition. The chemical composition of the blood. So we call these interoreceptors, a little bit different from external receptors in the skin, eyes, and our senses. The following pathway is called a coordination pathway, and this is used to integrate the nervous system, show how the nervous system is responsible for coordination of all stimulus that is felt. So we call this a coordination pathway. Okay, so again we have our stimulus. So this is the change in the environment. So the detection of heat, pain from heat. So the receptors, so the things that detect the change, these are sensory cells. In this case, these sensory cells are going to detect heat and pain. They then transmit that information into electrical impulses. So at this point, heat and pain are felt, and the messengers are the sensory nerves, neurons, and their job is to transmit impulses. So between this point and this point, we have our stimulus being converted into impulses. From there, they transmitted the sensory impulses via a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Okay, so the central nervous system, in this case, it is going to go to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is to its job is to work out what's going on. Okay, so it receives the information and it determines an appropriate response. It then sends information via motor neurons. So motor neurons, and they are electrical impulses again. These electrical impulses are then sent along motor neurons to the effector organs, and these might be muscles, glands. In the case of a burning match again, it's the muscles of the arm. So the electrical impulses stimulate the muscles to react, and then a response is felt. So this response is also what we could call the reaction. Next, we're going to look at the role specifically of thermoregulation and the nervous system's involvement in thermoregulation. So heat can be gained in the following number of ways. Through metabolism. So this is where through respiration glucose is oxidized, and through respiration there is a production of heat. The next bit is muscle contraction. Muscles contracting, one of the byproducts of them actually contracting is also generation of heat. So if we think about when you do physical activity, the amount of heat produced, this is due to muscles contracting. Hot food and drinks, by its very nature, you're putting something warm inside the body realizes there's an increase in temperature and will respond to that increase in temperature. And finally, external heat sources. So these external heat sources might be, if you're under lamps, actors on a stage, a lot of heat, that's going to affect the thermoregulation. The sun, those sorts of things also. So sun, obviously a very, very hot day, sun will increase the body's temperature. And finally, heaters. The following things will generate more heat loss from the body. So radiant heat loss will occur when the outside temperature is cooler. So when the external temperature is cooler. Heat always travels from warm area to cool area, so the outside area is cool. Radiant heat will be lost in that way. Same too can be said for convection. When there are winds or air moving over the skin, that skin takes away. So air moving over skin, the air takes away the warm, takes away heat and replaces it with cooler air. And finally, evaporation. So when you do exercise, you sweat, evaporation on the skin. The actual process of liquid transforming into a gas, going through a change of state into a gas, requires energy. So via its very process, energy is taken away. So evaporative cooling occurs when liquid transposes into a gas and is then evaporated from the body. So what we're going to finally look at is how homeostasis is maintained through negative feedback mechanisms, and we're going to use thermoregulation as the example. So we can see in the center here we have homeostasis, which is the body maintaining its temperature in and around 37 degrees. There's an increase in temperature, and an example of this is due to exercise or an increase in ambient temperature. So the day is warmer. So what that triggers is thermoreceptors in the skin send a message to the central nervous system, and specifically with the central nervous system, it is the hypothalamus part of the brain. The central nervous system is the hypothalamus, and when it comes to regulating increases in temperature, it's a heat loss mechanism within the anterior, so towards the front of the hypothalamus in the brain. So it determines there's an increase in temperature and works out an appropriate response. So a couple of things happen. First of all, we'll look at this top line here. A stimulus response is sent by neurons, motor neurons, to the arterioles. Look at these arterioles. And these are towards the surface of the skin, so arterioles at the surface of the skin. And what it does is it dilates these arterioles, so more blood flows to the surface of the skin. With more blood flowing to the surface of the skin temperature is therefore hotter. So skin temperature is hotter than the external environment, and evaporative cooling occurs. So heat is lost through radiant energy, evaporative cooling, and the body temperature decreases, and we return back to homeostasis. The other pathway that occurs is sweat glands. So hypothalamus sends a response from motor neurons to the sweat glands to initiate sweating. Sweating on the skin, the energy required for water to turn into gas takes heat away from the skin, body temperature decreases, and we return to homeostasis. So when there is the body temperature decreases in energy, and this may be due to cool external environment. A cool external environment. A sensory neuron sends an impulse to the central nervous system and again to the hypothalamus in the brain, but this time it's the posterior section of the hypothalamus in the brain. Now it's responsible for heat gain. So one of three things can happen. The first is that these blood vessels, these same arterioles, constrict. Okay, so the surface arterioles constrict, more blood is kept towards the center of the body rather than the peripheral skin. So it might respond, you might see blue lips and fingers looking a bit purple because blood is not as easy getting through those areas. So we see a constriction in those blood vessels. As there's a constriction in the blood vessels, less heat is lost by radiant energy to the external because the body is warmer than the outside, body temperature increases slightly, and homeostasis is reinstated. Another process that can occur is shivering. So the hypothalamus sends messages along motor neurons to the muscles that initiate shivering. That movement, that contraction and relaxation of the muscles uses energy. That energy generates heat, and that increases the body temperature. Finally, the hypothalamus sends electrical impulses along motor neurons to the erector pili muscles, the muscles that control the hairs on the skin. They stand upright, and what we see is goosebumps. So characteristic of the erector pili muscles working is goosebumps. As the hair is standing upright, it traps more heat. Helps to insulate the body and helps to reduce heat loss by convection and radiation. And these things working together, and in many cases simultaneously, helps the body temperature to increase and homeostasis to be reinstated. So it's also worth noting that when body temperature decrease, we have the turning off. So turning off of cooling mechanism. And in this case, we have a turning off of heating mechanism. So the body is continually responding to external information, or in fact internal information. The other thing that's not in this diagram is that in both cases there's a change in metabolism, so metabolic function changes, and this helps to stabilize temperature. So when the body gets too warm, metabolism slows down because metabolism generates heat. One of the reasons why in warm climates you don't feel sometimes as hungry. It's easier to maintain metabolic efficiency without the need for increased food. And when it gets cooler, the body initiates metabolic function, and that metabolic function then generates heat, and that heat is used to maintain homeostasis.